Okay, wow. Listeners, we're diving into some pretty heavy stuff today. Fascism in Europe, the Spanish Civil War, and World War II.
A lot to unpack there for
Yeah.
sure.
Three pretty intense topics, but that's why we do these deep dives. We'll try to break it down, see how these things all connect, and hopefully help you understand how fascism really took hold in 20th century Europe.
It's going to be quite the journey.
To start, maybe we should try to figure out what is fascism? Like, what are we even talking about?
Right.
I mean, the Fascism in Europe article, it defines fascism as this combination of traditional national unity and revolutionary anti-democratic rhetoric.
Mm.
Kind of contradictory, don't you think?
Yeah, it is. That's kind of the point, though.
Yeah.
Fascism, it thrives on these contradictions. It appeals to people who want to go back to some, like, idealized past.
Like, make whatever country great again.
Uh-huh. Yeah, exactly. They're yearning for this time of greatness and stability. But at the same time, they're also promised radical change, a break from the status quo.
So it's playing on nostalgia and then also this desire for something totally new.
Exactly. A potent mix.
Yeah.
Especially for people who were disillusioned with, all the chaos after World War I in Europe.
Yeah, you can see how that would be appealing, especially when you think about how ideas from guys like Charles Morris and Georges Sorel, they were writing decades earlier.
Yeah.
But their ideas about nationalism and revolution, they really kind of set the stage for this whole fascist movement.
It's fascinating, isn't it? How ideas can simmer for years
Right.
and then boom, the right conditions hit and they just explode.
And explode they did. Look at what happened all across Europe. Fascist regimes popping up everywhere. Italy, Germany, Portugal, Austria, Greece, Spain.
Each one with its own spin on fascism. Like even Portugal's Antonio de Oliveira Salazar,
Yeah.
he actually rejected that fascist label.
Really?
Yeah, even though he had a lot of those same characteristics in his regime.
Interesting. What didn't he like about the label?
Well, the article mentions that he criticized their emphasis um, on youth and force and the dominance of the leader. He preferred a more Catholic corporatist approach.
Corporatist. So, like, corporations running the country?
No, not quite like that. It's more like imagine different interest groups like workers and employers
Okay.
and industry leaders. They're all supposed to be working together, in harmony under the state.
Sound a little too good to be true, doesn't it?
It often was. In practice, it was a way to silence dissent.
Gotcha. Okay, so let's talk about Mussolini and Hitler. Their alliance kind of makes sense on the surface, right?
On the surface, for sure.
They both hated France and Yugoslavia.
Yep. For their own reasons, though.
Right. They had their own beef with each country. But, they were basically best buds, right?
Well, not so fast. It was a lot more complicated than that.
Really?
Yeah, they were definitely more like frenemies.
Oh, this is getting juicy. What was the drama?
Well, they agreed on the big stuff,
Mhm.
like the whole authoritarianism thing.
Yeah, and they both hated democracy.
Totally. But here's where things get interesting. Their views on race, totally different.
Wait, really? I always thought they were on the same page with all that, like, awful racial ideology.
Well, Hitler was obsessed with this idea of a pure Aryan race
Right.
with like very specific features. But Mussolini, in a speech in 1921, he said that Italians are part of the Aryan and Mediterranean race.
Huh, so he didn't really buy into Hitler's idea of, like, the Nordic, blonde-haired, blue-eyed thing.
Not really, no. He saw that as an insult to Italians, many of whom, of course, don't fit that mold.
Makes sense.
He even criticized Hitler for persecuting Jews, saying it actually proved that Germans weren't a pure race.
Wow, imagine the tension at those dinner parties.
Oh, I know, right? Their whole relationship was this mix of, like, shared goals, strategic convenience, but also this underlying clash of ideologies.
And I guess those ideas weren't just, like, theoretical, right? They played out in the real world.
Oh, absolutely. And that takes us to the Spanish Civil War. It's a perfect example of how these ideological battles can have devastating consequences.
Man, reading that Spanish Civil War article, it was chilling. Like, this whole country just fractured.
Yeah.
And it went way beyond politics. It's like the whole society was infected with this division.
It was a society on the brink.
The article even mentioned how kids' games reflected the conflict between the left and the right.
Wow, that's intense.
It really is. It was like this poison seeping into every aspect of life. And then, of course, it all exploded into this brutal war, the Republican government versus Franco's nationalists.
And it quickly became this proxy war. Other countries got sucked in.
Right. Germany and Italy were backing the nationalists, and the Soviet Union, plus all those international volunteers, the international brigades, They supported the Republicans.
Yeah. It was a truly international conflict.
And the death toll, I mean, it's staggering. The article gives a range from hundreds of thousands to over 1 million.
It's almost impossible to grasp the true scale of the suffering. And it wasn't just about the battles either.
Right, there are all those mass executions and people just disappearing.
A grim reminder that these ideological conflicts always have a very human cost.
It's clear that the Spanish Civil War was a turning point. It was like a dress rehearsal for World War II.
In a way, yeah.
It showed how these fascist ideologies, they could actually play out in a real conflict.
And win,
Hmm.
which of course just emboldened the fascist powers.
I think we need a little break to process all this.
Yeah, it's a lot to take in.
We've gone from, like, the confusing origins of fascism to this full-blown war in Spain,
It's all connected.
and it's all leading up to something even bigger. Join us next time as we tackle World War II and see how the fight against fascism shaped the rest of the 20th century. Welcome back, everyone. Last time we left off, things are getting intense. We were talking about the Spanish Civil War and how it kind of foreshadowed World War II.
It really did set the stage for the global conflict that was brewing.
Okay, so let's jump into World War II. The article makes it clear that fascist aggression basically started the whole thing.
Yes.
It wasn't just like one isolated event, but more like a chain reaction. And it all started with Hitler and his crazy expansionist ambitions.
Right. Hitler had this vision for this dominant German Reich.
Yeah.
And he was totally driven by that messed up belief in Aryan supremacy.
Oh, and this idea of Lebensraum, right?
Yeah.
Living space for the so-called master race.
Exactly. It was this toxic mix of ideology and just raw territorial ambition.
And Hitler, I mean, he wasn't exactly subtle about it either. He just like ignored all the international treaties, started remilitarizing Germany.
Yeah.
He basically just threw the whole peace that was established after World War I out the window.
Well, he saw those treaties as totally unfair, like humiliating.
Right.
They were just obstacles in his way. Obstacles in his way to making Germany a global power again.
Yeah.
And tragically, there were other leaders who felt the same way.
Yeah. Italy and Japan forming this axis of authoritarian regimes
The Axis powers.
with these shared dreams of like world domination.
It's crazy how they managed to present themselves as a force for change. Like they were going to create this new world order.
Right. Free from democracy and international cooperation, all that stuff.
And their message worked. I mean, it appealed to a lot of people who felt like they were left behind. They craved stability.
Right. They wanted to feel that national pride again.
Exactly.
And for a while, the Axis powers were super successful. They just conquered huge parts of Europe like it was nothing.
Well, they had this new military tactic called Blitzkrieg.
Blitzkrieg, like lightning war. Right.
Exactly. It was all about speed, surprise, just overwhelming
It
force.
was a totally new way of fighting a war.
Yeah.
And it worked, at least at first.
It really demoralized their opponents.
And the article, it talks about how the war just escalated. It started with these like regional conflicts and then became this global thing. It's
Yeah.
kind of hard to wrap your head around the scale of it all.
World War II was truly global. Battles happening across Europe, Asia, Africa, the Pacific. Yeah. Millions of people were dragged into this fight.
Soldiers and civilians.
It just shows you that even wars that, that start far away, they could still impact everyone.
Then in 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union.
A big turning point.
It was such a huge mistake for Hitler.
It really was. The Soviet Union was just too vast.
Right.
And the Red Army was super determined. I mean, they fought like crazy. It ended up stretching German forces way too thin.
Mm-hmm.
And that really turned the tide of the war.
And then, of course, there was D-Day, the Allied invasion of Normandy in 1944.
Another huge turning point.
So daring. I mean, they risked everything on that operation.
The Normandy landings were a massive undertaking, like nothing anyone had ever seen before. It really showed how committed the Allies were to liberating Europe.
It was a hard-fought victory for sure.
A victory that came at a very high cost.
So many lives lost. It's easy to focus on the battles and the tactics and stuff, but we can't forget, I mean, World War II is about so much more than that.
Right. It was a fight against fascism itself.
A struggle for democracy, human rights, a world without oppression.
Millions of people stood up against tyranny.
Yeah.
And thankfully they won.
Yeah. But at a terrible cost. I mean, millions dead, cities destroyed.
The scars of that war are still felt today. It makes you think about how fragile peace really is.
Speaking of the aftermath, the Fascism in Europe article mentions that after the war, there was this huge effort to dismantle all the fascist institutions
Yeah.
to prevent those ideologies from coming back,
There were war crimes trials, like Nuremberg.
where they held Nazi leaders accountable for, well, for everything.
It was a way to expose the horrors of the Nazi regime to the whole world.
Yeah, like a warning to future generations.
Exactly. A reminder of what happens when power goes unchecked.
Okay, but did it actually work? I mean, did fascism really disappear after the war?
That's a tough question. It's complicated. While the main fascist regimes were defeated, some of those ideas, they stuck around.
So it wasn't just like a few old Nazis hiding out.
Right.
Yeah.
New movements popped up, neo-fascist groups,
Yeah.
neo-Nazi groups.
They were inspired by the old ways, but trying to rebrand themselves.
Exactly.
And they found new ways to exploit people's fears.
Yeah, like economic anxiety, concerns about social change, immigration, all of that.
And they used that fear to gain power.
They were masters of propaganda.
And sometimes they even managed to infiltrate mainstream politics.
It's a reminder that these ideologies, they're adaptable, like a virus.
So even though fascism was defeated in World War II, those ideas, they didn't just vanish.
That's right. They went underground, waiting for the right moment to resurface.
Man, that's kind of disturbing.
It is. And it's why we need to learn from history.
Yeah, we can't just forget about what happened.
Exactly. We have to be able to recognize the warning signs
Yeah.
and fight back against any attempts to revive those hateful ideologies.
I think we need a moment to digest all of this.
Yeah, me too.
We've covered a lot of ground today. The global scale of World War II, the persistence of those fascist ideas.
It's a lot to take in.
But we're not done yet. Join us for the final part of our deep dive where we'll explore the legacy of fascism and talk about the lessons we can all learn from this dark chapter in history. Okay, so we're back. And if you've been following along, you know we've been on quite the journey. I mean, we started by looking at the roots of fascism in Europe.
Yeah.
Then went through World War II, all that.
A lot of ground covered, for sure.
And last time, we ended on a kind of a somber note.
Yeah.
Realizing that even though the big fascist regimes, they were defeated, some of those ideas, they hung around.
It's true. Fascism's legacy is complicated. It didn't just disappear overnight.
Right. So, where do we go from here? What are the big takeaways from all this? The World War II article, it talks about the aftermath, rebuilding, all that. But it feels like there's more to think about here.
Yeah, there is. You see, defeating the Axis powers, it didn't solve the problems that led to fascism in the first place.
Like the stuff that made those ideas so appealing to people.
Exactly. Things like economic inequality,
Mm-hmm.
social unrest, political polarization.
Right. Those are all fertile ground for extreme ideologies.
Exactly.
And it's not just about these big societal problems, right? The Spanish Civil War article, it talked about how those divisions, they infected every aspect of life.
You're right. Down to the games children played.
It's wild to think about that, this virus spreading through society.
Fascism, it needs that division. It feeds on fear.
Here.
It preys on people's anxieties.
It offers those simple solutions to complicated problems.
Exactly. And often ends up blaming, scapegoating entire groups of people.
It's easy to look back and judge, right? How could they fall for that?
Yeah.
But you have to remember, the context. A lot of people back then, they were desperate.
Oh, absolutely. They were disillusioned. They'd seen democracy fail. There was economic hardship. The Great Depression hit a lot of people hard. And then this, looming fear of communism.
And along come these fascist leaders offering this vision of unity, strength.
Yeah, a return to a better time, a mythical past.
And they didn't hesitate to use violence and intimidation to get what they wanted. It really shows how fragile democracy can be.
It does. And it's a stark reminder that we have to be vigilant. We have to protect it from those who would exploit fear for their own gain.
So that's a big lesson from all this. We can't just assume democracy will always be there.
Right. It takes work.
We have to actively participate, hold our leaders accountable.
Speak out against injustice.
And, doing this deep dive, I'm seeing some of those same tendencies today. Not exactly the same, but echoes.
Oh, for sure. It's important to be aware of the warning signs.
What should we be looking out for?
Well, the scapegoating, like we talked about. The glorification of violence,
Mm-hmm.
demonizing anyone who's different,
Mm-hmm.
and eroding trust in democratic institutions.
Those are all pretty serious red flags.
They are. And we can't just ignore them. We have to be proactive.
Like a fire alarm going off.
Exactly.
You have to put the fire out before it spreads.
And a big part of that is education. We need to understand the history of fascism, really get to the root of it.
Yeah, so we can recognize it and resist it.
Exactly.
Man, this whole deep dive it's been a lot.
Yeah.
It's heavy stuff, but really important, you know? I think the big takeaway for me is that fighting fascism, it didn't end in 1945. It's something we have to keep doing every day.
I agree. We have to be vigilant. We have to defend those democratic values.
And remember the victims.
Yes, the millions who suffered.
Their stories, they remind us of what can happen when hatred and intolerance are allowed to take root.
And when power goes unchecked.
So thank you for joining us on this deep dive. It's been a journey, for sure.
It has.
But I hope you've learned something and that you'll join us in fighting for a better future.
A future where the horrors of fascism are never repeated.
This has been the deep dive. Keep questioning, keep learning, and never stop fighting for what's right.